Yeast as additives. Oh boy, this topic takes me back to the MW exam. Might be giving me a little bit of PTSD. I really don't want to do a pros and cons style video blog about the use of native yeast versus commercial yeast. This is not the MW exam, after all, no matter how much it's beginning to feel that way. That's just not really the spirit of this series. This series is about additives and explaining to consumers what additives may be used in winemaking and why those additives are used in winemaking. As far as yeast additions go, I don't know if this is the most interesting topic in the wine business or the most boring topic in the wine business, and I'm currently leaning towards the latter. So how can I make this educational for you and not boring for me? I think I want to talk about this topic first broadly, but then layer in my personal experiences in the winery. As an MW, I always start with the definition. If you can't define it, you can't talk about it. Very simply, native yeast, which may also be called wild yeast or indigenous yeast, are those that are naturally present on the grapes themselves. They're kind of floating around in the winery or just about anywhere in the environment where wine is being made. These yeasts are typically unidentified strains of yeast in the Saccharomyces cerevisiae family, which is the primary yeast responsible for alcoholic fermentation in wine. And as a winemaker, you don't have to do anything for a fermentation to start, except maybe making sure that the grape and the resulting juice is not too cold. The fermentation will start on its own anywhere from within a couple of days to within a week. Commercial strains are specific strains, most often Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but sometimes other types that are developed in a lab. So these strains are designed to exhibit certain beneficial traits like thriving in high sugar fermentations or low pH environments. They are selected for their ability to produce specific aromatic or flavor compounds, something that I'll dive into shortly. Just like for making bread, commercial yeasts are purchased in a freeze-dried form and they must be rehydrated with warm water. Let me start with the argument for native yeast. Native yeasts are a part of the vineyard's microbiome and they contribute to the wine. I just realized I have an addendum to this because I'm never comfortable saying that anything is true. And so me just saying that yeast are part of the microbiome of a vineyard, I'm kind of like, yeah, that seems to make sense. But I also know that yeast can travel, they can move, they can go from one vineyard to another. We still have hot water, this is a disaster. But anyway, I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about yeasts and how they travel, right? As I mentioned this, and I thought maybe I should be more specific about that. I started thinking about how during harvest, we are all sharing, those of us who are purchasing fruit, even when we're not, I guess, because we're using macro bins. Everyone's taking these picking bins, right? Our big half-ton macro bins, and they go all over the valley. You know, they might start at Bien Nacido, but we might take those Bien Nacido macro bins and use them to pick Joy Fantastic, and then somehow they end up back at Bien Nacido. But like when they start at Bien Nacido, if they've picked like Dragonette's wines the day before, and those go to Dragonette, and then Bien Nacido picks up their bins and takes them back out to Bien Nacido, and then they pick our Roussan and bring it to us. It's like, aren't there yeast all over those macro bins all the time and all over the equipment that's coming into our vineyard? Like Peter and I don't have our own equipment, and so surely just in the soil and everything that's coming in just on the tires of a tractor, like, is that bringing a different yeast population into our winery that isn't native to the Joy Fantastic, let's say, whatever that means? And I don't know the question to this, but I mean the answer to this. I'm always just out there posing questions, and I want to have conversations like this, not because actually they're not really that important, I don't think, but they're interesting to me. Like, this is what I'm interested in talking about in the wine business and or in wine making. And so I went online this morning, and I'm going to post this article below from, I think it's from Iowa State University, just a really thoughtful article about what even does native mean. And if it's native in your winery, is it native just because it's in your winery? But is that a commercial strain that is now native? It just lives in your winery. Is that considered native? If you don't inoculate and you say you're using native yeast, but it's actually a commercial yeast because you maybe have not had it tested, does that make it native still? I don't know the answer to that. But hopefully at some point we get hot water so I can do something about my hair. That yeast can travel, they can move, they can go from one vineyard to another, they can go pretty far. Do every year your vineyards have the same yeast? I don't know. We've had ours tested one time, and the only thing that we know is that they're Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but they are not identified as species from that particular lab, right? So I'm so hesitant to say that anything is true because I always feel like there are 7,000 exceptions. And one of those might be that, yeasts are the microbiome one year or the next year. And the other thing is that certain yeasts, native yeasts, can start fermentation. But if you've ever had commercial yeast or used commercial yeast in your winery, it's likely that those kind of come in and take over. And it's just really hard. It's just really hard to say anything with certainty. That's all I feel anymore about anything. Contribute to the wine's unique sense of place, or I always like to quote Matt Kramer on this, a sense of somewhereness, right? In theory, though, for sure not always in practice, boy, that's a whole separate video. High quality wines should exhibit certain characteristics that tell you where they are from. That's what blind tasting in the MW and the MS is based on. Can you tell where it's from? You should be able to. I like to liken this to bees and honey. Bees collect nectar from various flowers, and the types of flowers available in their environment directly influence the flavor, aroma, and texture of a honey. As an example, wildflower honey reflects a broad diversity of blooms in any particular location, much like wine reflects the local yeast and the terroir. But I think it's important not to make an argument in a vacuum that native yeast equals terroir. The only way to prove this is through some semi-scientific trials. So I'm going to provide a personal example. I kind of have to start way back in time. The year was 2001. Peter got his first job, his first winery job, working at Stoltman Vineyards, one of the, most popular wineries in Santa Barbara County, and also one of my favorite wineries in Santa Barbara County still to this day. Back then, when Peter started in the wine business, almost everything was inoculated with commercial yeast. It just was. Even though, I think by this point, Robert Parker had probably already reached his apex mountain of influence a few years before. But this point was the early noughts, right? And it was ingrained in winemakers that scores were how wine was sold. And consumers were conditioned, rightly or wrongly, to pay attention to scores. So winemakers were chasing Parker scores, and in chasing Parker scores, grapes tended to be picked riper and the alcohol levels higher. And as an aside, the wines were oakier. But anyway, the high sugar content of the grapes, I am postulating, made it difficult for native yeasts, which tend to be less hardy than commercial yeast, to complete a fermentation. Cut to me entering the winemaking scene at our winery. One of my self-appointed roles in the winery is always to say, okay, why are we doing that? Do we need to do that? Does it make the wine better? So around, I would say 2008, 2009, Peter and I started to ask ourselves these kinds of questions about yeast and additives. And that resulted in some trials. We did trials in the winery with the same lots of grapes. So grapes picked at the same time, made in all the same ways, with the one variable being, in the case of our Roussan trial, 1 barrel out of 4 was inoculated with commercial yeast. And in the case of our Genuine Risk, 1 tank out of 2 was inoculated with commercial yeast. The others were left to their own devices and were native. In these trials, we found that for our winery, for our grapes, for our wines, that native ferments were healthier in the case of the Cabernet Sauvignon. And by healthier, I just mean that the fermentation was faster, it was a little bit more vigorous, which is a little bit of a contradiction to what most people believe about wild yeast versus commercial yeast. And then for the Roussan, the inoculated barrel, it tasted like yeasty. It was almost like bread. It smelled like baking bread. And most of that really dissipated during the élevage. We still preferred the native yeast barrels on the Roussan. So we decided after those trials to use native yeast on the vast majority of our ferments. But this wasn't out of some commitment to dogma. It was because the wines, in our case, were better for it. There is always one exception to this rule, and that's that we always inoculate our rosé. And that's because grapes for rosé, they come in really early in the season, practically before any other grapes, and the winery isn't yet slathered with yeast the way it is later in the season when we have lots of tanks fermenting, everything's very active. Because we want the rosé to be clean and pretty, and we don't want any off aromas, we inoculate it after a day or so. So in conclusion, personal experience, at holus bolus, native yeasts are best. Our wines tend to be lower in alcohol, lower 13.5% or less. So we don't worry about stuck ferments so much. Though I will say this harvest in 2024, we did have a stuck ferment and we added yeast hulls to help it along. More on that in our next video on yeast nutrients. Okay, so what is the argument for commercial yeast? One of the most significant benefits of using commercial yeast is just reliability. Commercial yeast, they perform really consistently across many different conditions and generally provide faster, more efficient fermentations, which minimize the aforementioned risk of a stuck fermentation and the production of any off aromas. Commercial yeast can be tailored to the style of the wine being produced, meaning that certain strains are bred specifically to create a particular flavor profile. And I'll put a link to Scott Labs below so you can check some of their products out. Also, in terms of timing, native yeast ferments are not as reliable as commercial yeast in like getting the fermentation going, and sometimes can be a little sluggish. So sometimes decisions, they're made in the winery for convenience or logistics. That's just the way harvest goes sometimes. You might think that only large producers have to make decisions based on things like tank space and timing, but I don't know. I would argue that this is even a larger burden on small producers who have less winery space and fewer fermentation tanks, which are very expensive, and they take up a lot of space when they're only used for a couple of months out of the year. So for instance, if you have a cool season and harvest is lagging, but suddenly it gets warm and ripening speeds up, you may need to get your Pinot Noir through fermentation really quickly so that you can press the Pinot Noir and then bring your Syrah in and ferment it in the tank that the Pinot Noir was in. Inoculating with commercial yeast will speed up this fermentation process and allow for a greater tank turnover. So why does any of this matter in reference to natural wine? That's how we got started in this, right? By talking about natural wine. If the natural wine debate is about yeast being a way to express terroir, that's fine. But if native yeast produce off aromas or stuck fermentation, then the terroir debate just dies right there because one assumes stinky is not a terroir type, right? Also, as far as the terroir argument goes, not everyone drinks wine to taste the place. A lot of people drink wine because it has a flavor profile that they like. I mean, Sauvignon Blanc might be the best example of this. Sauvignon Blanc fans are zealots, right? They love grassy, gooseberry, cat pee aromas that are typical of Sauvignon Blanc. And in response to this, certain yeast strains have been developed that produce these super aromatic qualities and overtly tropical flavors that people love. It does not make people who drink those wines bad people because they are drinking a wine that was inoculated with commercial yeast, just as it does not make the wine producer who makes those wines bad people. It just makes them people who have a preference for something. And this is, I don't know, maybe a question. Is there an argument in the natural wine movement for less processed wine? I honestly don't know if there is, but it seems like that's something someone might say. Well, that's kind of baloney because wine is very, very processed product, yeast additions or not. So that's my long tutorial on yeast additions in the winery. I hope it filled in some holes or at least explains why a wine producer might make the choice to use commercial yeast over native yeast or vice versa.